Good morning, y'all. Welcome to our third event celebrating the RGK Center's 20th anniversary. My name is David Springer, and I am the director of the RGK Center and a professor at the LBJ School of Public Affairs. I want to thank you to those of you who have joined us last week for Dr. Francie Osterauer's discussion around data in the nonprofit art sector. We're so thankful for faculty members like Francie and Sarah Jane, who bring not only their expertise to the classroom, but also continue to contribute impactful research to nonprofit management and volunteerism. And thank you all for your continued support of the center and for taking the time to gather with us this morning. I'm delighted to see some new and familiar faces in the virtual crowd. If you're new to the RGK Center, we hope you feel like a friend by the end of our time together this morning. We're honored to have a couple of our advisory council members joining us on our panel today, who Sarah Jane will introduce to you shortly. Your support of the center is integral to achieving our mission and helping us blaze new trails in philanthropy. And we thank you for everything that you do. We'd also like to recognize the invaluable contributions of our 20th anniversary honorees who are here today. So thank you all for your continued support of our work. I'm thrilled to introduce my friend and colleague, Dr. Sarah Jane Rehnborg, one of our longtime core faculty members at the center, and as many of you know, an esteemed researcher in the field of volunteerism. Sarah Jane has made an incredible impact on the field of volunteerism research, both statewide and nationally. Since the beginning, she's offered UT students an opportunity to learn how to mobilize and engage with volunteers and effectively engage community members in the nonprofit sector. Before I turn things over, I'd like to, if I may, share a couple of brief Sarah Jane stories. Sarah Jane was one of the first people to approach Curtis Meadows, our founding director, who's with us today, with the proposal for the RGK Center. As you know, that was more than 20 years ago. And Sarah Jane was later the center's first professional hire. So after the center was established, Sarah Jane introduced new coursework on nonprofits and volunteerism from the course that Curtis taught, which soon became one of the first courses offered as part of our nonprofit studies portfolio program. Sarah Jane was also the person that reached out to me 7 or 8 years ago and invited me to lunch at Eastside Cafe to essentially invite me to consider joining the RGK Center and serving as the next director. And it has turned out to be a brilliant move and one of the best moves that I've made in my career. It is the sweet spot in my academic home at UT Austin. And the work that we continue to do with our team it's fun, it's meaningful, it makes an impact. And so Sarah Jane, just a personal thank you to you for influencing the trajectory of my work and my career, as you've done for so many others. Before we get started with today's event, I've got a few housekeeping details to share with you. Today's event will be recorded and later uploaded to our website, and we'll share that with the public. If you have any questions about the recording, please contact one of the RGK Center staff members. And please save your questions for the Q&A portion after the panel discussion and use the raise hand feature on Zoom. Any questions put in the chat during the Q&A portion will not be answered live, but if we run out of time at the end, please put any lingering questions in the chat and we'll be sure to direct them to the right panelist after the event. I believe we also have a short survey we'll ask you to take in the last couple of minutes of the event. If you could, please take a moment to fill this out. It helps us plan programming for the future. And so just on a final note, I'm just so glad that y'all are with us today. And Sarah Jane, with that, it's my pleasure to turn it over to you.
Thank you so much, David. It's a pleasure to be with all of you today and to have the opportunity to share some of the work we've been doing in volunteerism. Before I get started, I would like to quickly introduce our panelists who you'll be hearing from later. And first, I'd like to introduce Greg Baldwin. Greg is CEO of Volunteer Match and has done wonders to make an invisible field very visible. We have Mike King, who's with Volunteers of America as its CEO and president, and he's been doing some exceptional work in the area of diversity, equity, and inclusion. We have Jane Justice, who is a person who's been in the field for a long time, but now has the opportunity to be a philanthropist as president of the Leedy Foundation. And we have Jerome Tennille, who is with us from representing corporate social responsibility. He's with Marriott International and also on the Maryland Commission for National Service. And Noel Landit, who's a colleague of mine at the university and director of the Institute for Organizational Excellence. But first, I'd like to focus on Curtis Meadows. Curtis, as you know, is the founder of the center, and had it not been for his vision, we wouldn't even be discussing volunteerism relative to the RGK Center. So I'd like to turn the program over to Curtis so that he might share from his perspective as founder, his initial philosophical focus on the direction of the center and what the RGK Center is about. Curtis.
Thank you. Welcome to everybody who's present and attending. About 20 plus years ago, I was approached by the president, Larry Faulkner of the university, Dean Max Sherman, and Dean Ed Dorn, with the idea of coming and teaching at the university courses in nonprofit management, because approximately a third of the graduates of the LBJ school were going into nonprofit work and were feeling that there was not an adequate preparation for that kind of work. I told them that I would come if I could establish a university-wide academic center focused on the role of the non-government, charitable, and philanthropic sector of our nation, similar to what had been established at the University of Indiana's School for Philanthropy. I was convinced that such a center was best situated in the School of Public Affairs because the public policy issues that have been surrounding our long history of encouraging our citizens to undertake individual and group action to address the various issues of our time outside or in addition to what government might be doing and business. Our initial funding came from Lady Bird Johnson, who believed in the idea of the center once she heard about it and the location of it in the school. She even joined in soliciting the major funding source of the RGK Foundation and persuaded the LBJ Foundation to become one of our biggest funders. And she even came to my classes for many years when I would be teaching. From my experience as a lawyer and then as president of the Meadows Foundation and as a volunteer at my church and many nonprofit organizations, I had become convinced that the most successful nonprofits that were sustainable did so when they were organized to function with three essential concepts. They were like the legs of a three-legged stool. The first was the voluntary engagement of a group of people committed to a common mission. The second was the application of management principles to organize, strategically plan, articulate, and actualize the mission and goals they were trying to accomplish. The third leg was to raise the funding necessary to enable the program envisioned by that group of people to become a reality. So from my perspective, voluntary community action is at the heart of the whole structure of the nonprofit, non-government center. However, the successful use of volunteer and leadership positions in all aspects of accomplishing nonprofit work requires not only inspiring and recruiting volunteers, but applying management systems to utilize their talents effectively towards achieving the goals of the agency while providing a worthwhile experience for the volunteer. I was convinced that the RGK Center should promote coursework in volunteerism, philanthropic practices, and nonprofit management. Thus, from the beginning, we were the RGK Center for Philanthropy and Community Service. Now, it was one thing to conceptually think about all of this, but finding the leadership qualified to lead an academic program focused on volunteerism might have been challenging, except that I had met and seen the work of a recognized thought leader in the field at other events where I'd heard her speak and had listened to and seen her work. Fortunately, I was able to recruit Sarah Jane Rehnborg. She was already on the campus at that time, and she led the center's work in this field until her retirement a few years ago. So I'm so glad today that we're all joining this at her invitation to join in the presentations, and I'm just grateful for Sarah Jane for all of the work she's done over these years.
Thank you, Curtis. It's been an honor to be at the center and to follow on what Curtis was discussing. Elevating volunteerism within the nonprofit sector has been somewhat tricky, and we can put up the first slide just as a reference point. Because the term volunteer is similar to the term voluntary, people often get very confused about the work of this component of the nonprofit sector in collaboration with what the nonprofit sector is. Voluntary and volunteer, while not completely interchangeable, are at least overlapping. And yet separating these so that one might actually look at the work of volunteers has been complex and a real academic undertaking. We do know that 63 million people, and I would suggest it is more than that in the United States, are involved with volunteering. It is hard to define that particular world for a whole variety of reasons. And it's equally hard to research and study what this world is about. For example, volunteers rarely appear on the flow or organizational chart of a nonprofit organization, so their work frequently goes unnoticed. There's also issues of identification. Many people who are actively engaged in service identify with the work that they're doing, as opposed to the fact that they're doing it without compensation. So people refer to themselves as trustees or choir members, but not as necessarily as volunteers. We also have gender and social class issues. Volunteering has long been considered, very incorrectly, but still nonetheless, as white women's work of a certain socioeconomic and educational class. In addition, there is terminology confusion. Is this service learning? Is service learning volunteering? What if you're on an internship and not being paid? Are you an intern? And what about some of the service corps? Some are salaried below market value. Others receive no compensation. And then there are boundary challenges that also exist. When is someone a volunteer versus a member of an organization versus being a good citizen versus being neighborly or helping? All variations on a theme, and yet one often needs to define what a volunteer is if you're going to study it. In addition, there's a lot of incorrect usage around the term. We speak of an all-volunteer army, where in fact, in the US, it's not all volunteer, it is voluntary. Once one chooses to serve, one is compensated if you're in the military. And then, as we have found with some of the international work that the center has done, the term volunteer does not always translate into other languages effectively, nor is the concept readily understood. So making this an academic endeavor has been a challenge from the get-go. Nonetheless, we've worked hard to do that. And if we can flip to the next slide, we begin to look at some of the work that the center has done. We have been very fortunate in the two instances listed on this particular slide with the Corporation for National and Community Service and the Jewish Federation to actually be approached by each of these organizations with research questions that they had. Particularly with the Jewish Federation of North America, the question was, do service immersion programs help develop the Jewish identity among Jewish young people? A fascinating opportunity to look at. With the corporation, they were asking us to look at what are the characteristics of programs that effectively engage the community. As we go to the next slide, We look at some of our other research. We have been very grateful recipients of the support of the One Star Foundation here in Texas, as we've analyzed a number of issues both with and for them. Points of Light has been a key contributor and partner in some of our assessment and diagnostic work. We've analyzed what student volunteerism looks like on the campus of Texas. We've been very fortunate to have had funding to develop curriculum materials, to create a booklet on the strategic engagement of volunteers, because it's not just a program, but volunteers, when they are effectively engaged, are mission-oriented, furthering the goals of the organization, and are a strategy, not an individual implementation or component of an organization, but something that is organization-wide. And we've had several opportunities to analyze AmeriCorps programs. As we flip to the next slide, we look at not just some of the research that we've done, although that has been critical, but we've also had student projects. One of them with the Texas Parks and Wildlife that helped them identify and create the right technology to support their volunteerism initiatives. With the Dallas Foundation, we were engaged with executive education. And within that component, it was very important to elevate the role of volunteers as a strategy with the organizations that we work to support. We worked through a class with the Literacy Council of Central Texas to find ways to help them improve their volunteer engagement. And the list goes on, but I'd also like to add that we've been very fortunate to have had students who have taken on the topic in various ways on both master's theses, for example, looking at volunteerism and other components of the field, as well as PhD programs, PhD students who have used our data for their dissertations and have successfully completed their PhD. So it has been an honor to be at the center, but I think one of the other really exciting things has been that we have been consistently able to offer coursework on a graduate level in volunteer and community engagement that has consistently, the classes have consistently filled with students from across campus. We've had students from kinesiology, from communications, from the law school, from social work, just all across the university, looking at how do you effectively engage volunteers in the work of nonprofits, and for that matter, what are some of the legal and policy issues. So that's just a thumbnail of some of the things the center has been doing. But at this point, I'd really like to turn to our panelists and begin with Greg Baldwin. As I mentioned, Greg is with Volunteer Match, and he has been very involved with making a very invisible component highly visible through Volunteer Match, the uses of technology and social media. Greg, you've also been looking at the effects of the pandemic and COVID on the world of service, and I'm wondering if you can share a few of your thoughts with us.
Absolutely. So in March of last year, we got a significant grant from the Gates Foundation to field some research across our stakeholder base. Volunteer Match supports about 130,000 nonprofits across the country, help them find the volunteers that they need. We work with about 150 companies, and tens of millions of volunteers come through the platform every year to find meaningful opportunities to serve in their community. So the research, we fielded 4 surveys, collected responses from about 5,600 folks across, a cross-sector research study to really tap into what the significant impact of COVID was having, specifically on volunteer programs and the nonprofits operating them. And it should come as no surprise that the news was not particularly good. Over the course of the 4 surveys, the final survey, we asked, what's the current status of your organization, try to understand the resources they were operating with. And we've seen a steady increase in reporting on organizations that are nonprofit organizations that report they're operating with reduced resources compared to pre-COVID. And this is a question that intentionally combines both volunteering and giving. When you put the two together, organizations, there's a small portion of organizations that have really done well during the crisis in terms of philanthropy and giving. But overall, the big picture is that most organizations, they've really struggled with the economics and the social capital that volunteering brings into their organizations as a resource. It should come as no surprise that immediately after the crisis, there was a massive decline in volunteer attendance. We had 72% of our nonprofits in March report that they were experiencing heavy cancellations in their volunteer programs. That number has declined significantly. It's down to about 40% right now, as of October. Sorry, I clarify that. So the data is still, only goes through October of last year. So we are seeing that continues to improve, but there's a steady increase in just, some cancellations. So programs are still trying to find the volunteers that they need in a very, very difficult environment. The good news, or the silver lining, but make no mistake, it is a silver lining in what is otherwise cloudy skies, is that, like the rest of us, the nonprofit sector has been enormously resilient and innovative in a time of crisis, and has turned to, guess what, Zoom and all the digital technology tools that the rest of us have grown to love and hate, to try to reinvent their volunteering experiences as a virtual experience. And one of the affirming things that we've certainly seen over the last year is programs that I could not have ever imagined being virtual, turning into virtual programs. There were some programs that were already out there, Crisis Text Line, Micro Mentor. These were already virtual programs where folks were interacting using, phones and computers and technology. But to see dance classes and senior citizen yoga groups, to see mentoring programs, to see reading programs transform themselves into virtual experiences has been really a mark of the sector's resiliency, and a mark of people's resiliency to find ways around the problems that we face. In that spirit, we also have seen specific data, and I should give you a data point on that. So volunteering, in October, we asked nonprofits, in what ways have you adjusted your volunteer engagement strategy given current environmental, economic, and social conditions? 51% of nonprofits reported in October that they have begun creating more virtual volunteering experiences. And the number of individual volunteers who have experienced volunteering virtually has doubled from July, from 17% who had ever volunteered virtually to 29%. So that's a data point to show the significance of the virtual experience and virtual volunteering, which had been around for 20 years, but it really been sort of a sideshow. So the last piece, just to conclude, is that this impact is also, you can see it in workplace giving. Volunteering is actually on the rise. Workplace giving programs are actually thinking right now, as of October, 38% of them are actually planning to spend more money on more time and energy on their volunteering programs. And then the last data point is that, it was already hard enough to get people to volunteer. You have time and money and resources and all the other things that, finding the right opportunity that got in the way of volunteering. And now you have to add to the list fear of being exposed to illness, fear of exposing others to illness, the pandemic, the legacy of the pandemic has, lingers on, and will be, it will be years, I think, before this sector fully recovers. But at least it will take along with it some of the great innovations that have come along during this time that allow people to interact in new ways. So that is the data. Thank you.
Thank you, Greg. And if you have questions, please jot them down for our Q&A session. I'd like now to turn to Jane Justice, who we're very pleased to have joining us. Not only does she have strong field background in the world of volunteerism, both leading volunteers and being a trainer in the world of volunteerism, but she's now president of the Leedy Foundation and using this position to further volunteerism. Jane. You're on mute.
Jane.
There you go. Yes, this whole new world of Zoom.
Yeah, we talked about a book that needed to be published about all the Zoom stories we have, and we were going to title it, You're on Mute. So, Well, let me say what a treat it is for me to share the virtual stage with you, Sarah Jane, and Greg and Mike, all of us who are old friends and colleagues from my years of national training in volunteer engagement. It's great to see you and hear from you, and for Curtis as well, who was one of my early mentors and my father's. When my dad started a small family foundation in the mid 80s and asked my brother and me to be directors. And Dad used to say that starting a family foundation was like catching a porcupine. First you throw a wash tub over it, and then that gives you something to sit on until you figure out what you're going to do next. Most people who have family foundations have agreed that that is what it feels like. My dad and my brother and I were very different in almost every arena, but we all agreed on the fact that philanthropy somehow needed to be more than just writing a bunch of checks. And can we put the first slide up, please? Wait for it. Wait. There we are. There's my dad. There's a philanthropist from Dallas, actually, who, when asked what her definition of philanthropy was, said she thought it was the practice of returning to the community pot of assets, that which we have taken out, and perhaps a smidgen more. We decided that that was a good definition for us to be working with, as well as our as we began to figure out our grant making strategy. And we also knew that we could increase the return on investment, all of our investments in our foundation, if we were also contributing our time and our talent, as well as the treasure part. So after years of working in the nonprofit sector, training in this arena, I felt sort of like the farmer's insurance guy who says, I know a thing or two because I've seen a thing or two. And I had seen a lot of the good and the bad and the ugly. And one thing I came out believing is that the strength of the volunteer resources infrastructure and workforce is almost always directly related to the overall health of the organization and its ability to accomplish its mission. It was sort of like the canary in the mine. And so when I started in grant making, I spent as much time and energy looking at not only the stewardship of financial resources of an organization, but also how did they steward their human resources? Well, I'll move on. Early on, we realized that there was very little attention given by other funders to this particular hallmark of an effective organization. And so we made it a priority funding area for ours. We did individual capacity building grants, but over the last few years, we have begun to lead national efforts to encourage conversations and to start some sort of strategic partnerships between funders and nonprofit organizations to see if we can elevate these conversations and become more effective at utilizing this resource. Next slide. So what do we mean by strategic volunteer engagement? It's very simple. It leverages the power of volunteers to expand the impact and to maximize the mission accomplishment. And that, for maximum impact, again, which is what we looked at carefully, volunteer engagement and volunteer energy must be deployed strategically. We've all had the experience where we would rather have dental surgery than ever go back and do that kind of voluntary experience again. And other times when we felt like we made a tremendous difference and it was a great experience, whether it was a big job or a small job. And the research has shown over the last many years that organizations that strategically engage their volunteers are significantly more adaptable and sustainable and do it on the same amount of work on a smaller budget. Next slide. But the misconception that we have seen from the beginning of our doing this work to today still remains in the funding community and the nonprofit community. the volunteer engagement is seen as a program. I think Sarah Jane mentioned this, rather than a renewable resource and a critical strategy for being able to accomplish a mission by both the nonprofits and the funders. And the result is that the nonprofits don't see that program as a priority and don't ask for funding for it. And the funders say, well, we don't fund volunteerism, we fund the environment, or we fund early childhood education. Somehow we need to work to be able to change this paradigm. And I want to talk a little bit, maybe in the question and answer time, about 2 guides that we have produced. One for funders and one for the nonprofit organization, on trying to develop some common language and start these conversations that are so important to being had, that will lead to the innovation that we need to be seeing in the partnership.
Thank you, Jane. In addition to looking at volunteerism as a strategy, we also need to look at the environment within which we are working. Greg has mentioned the whole world of the pandemic and COVID and the impact of it, but we also have other issues that impinge and are critical to our world and to our forward movement. Working effectively in those has been Mike King, who is president of Volunteers of America. And his organization has spent considerable time looking at the questions of diversity, inclusion, and equity, and would like to share a little bit about what is going on with Volunteers of America. Mike?
Sure, thank you. Well, our DEI journey really began 3 years ago when we established really achieving much greater percentages of participation and percentages of election to the national board, to the senior management team, those things as one of our top 3 strategic priorities of the whole organization. And so we were moving along with that and actually led by the board. And this is where the board engagement was just so critical. We were probably only at about 10 or 15% people of color on our national board. And this national board was not a self-electing national board. It was a national board that's truly elected by a membership. So you really had a challenge there as far as recruitment and cultivation of new board members, and then getting them elected. And to their credit, because of their commitment to it, truly leading the way for the staff, in fact, we achieved 45% of people of color within a 3-year period. And then we really asked that management be held accountable for the same kind of achievement, and we did likewise. But that was the easy part. To be candid, when we had the tragic events of this past summer, that truly focused a spotlight like none of us had ever seen, but it also really began a different learning journey for us. And so we utilized a consultant named Dr. Camilla Wood here in Washington, D.C., who is also a pediatrician by trade, but who had a data-driven presentation about the challenges of truly dealing with racism and trying to create more of an anti-racist movement, if you will, in the social justice world. She made a presentation to our board retreat, and this was all virtual. Again, we've been like everyone else that's been impacted. We haven't had a face-to-face meeting of our national board since last March. But I have to tell you, since we went virtual, we have 100% attendance at our board meetings, and we never had 100% attendance at national board meetings before all of this. So there's some good along with that. Dr. Wood's presentation was moving, very moving, in that it had the data to back up the concerns and the issues. And what it did was it opened up our own board members to start sharing personal stories, intimate personal stories of things they had faced in their lives that were, it falls into that category of those appropriately awkward conversations. Because it was those things that no one had really thought about in that way, no one who was not of color. And so it was really led by our people of color on the board, and then responded to so well by those who were not of color in the learning experience of this. It changed the whole feeling and vibe from our board, and then that really transmitted to the staff who were present for that meeting. And then we were able to take that into our regular meetings with our CEOs. Uh, what it did was it truly bonded the organization. Now, to be honest, transparency has been absolutely key, absolutely key. And in that transparency, there's not a day goes by that I don't have to acknowledge that I have signed up for a class from which I will never graduate. I will never graduate. I learn something every day. We will never take a step back and think, oh, we've got this. No, you're kind of never there. It's a constant learning opportunity, learning and expanding your own capacity for empathy, and at the same time acknowledging that you don't know what your good colleague has lived through and the experiences they have had, and more importantly, how it made them feel. And so that has been a wonderful journey for us. It's been appropriately awkward at times, but at the very same time, it's been wonderful because it keeps us transparent and keeps us honest with each other. And so we've taken that into private study groups of our executive management team, having our own private study group on social justice and anti-racism, and we've taken it on through our CEOs of all of our local affiliates. And now we're developing a program to take it into their boards. So that's sort of the Reader's Digest summary of this phase of our DEI journey.
Thank you so much, Mike. I think it's interesting to talk about an education that never ends, a class that will continue going. I'm very pleased to have the opportunity to bring to you Jerome Tennille. Jerome comes to us with a wide range of experience and interests, including national service and his work with Marriott International and corporate social responsibility. But he also has some really interesting thoughts on equity in the philanthropic sector and ways in which strategic philanthropy can help us address some of the barriers to equity. Jerome, we look forward to your comments.
Thank you so much, Sarah Jane. And first and foremost, I just want to say that it's certainly an honor to be here and to share the stage with so many other great professionals. And it's also great to see familiar and new faces within the audience. So in terms of the importance of equity and volunteering, you know, when I think about volunteering, to me, it's one of the strongest forms of exercising one's individual democracy. It's a form of civic engagement. And so like a vote in a political election, you know, volunteers are placing their vote of time for causes and values that they care for that are deeply important for them. And so the issue that I see is that those that have less economic, social, and human capital also have less access to the same opportunities to volunteer through formal organizations. And oftentimes these barriers are financial or material in nature and actually affect BIPOC communities to a larger degree. And so if we are to understand volunteering as civic engagement, then just like we would work to get out the vote or turn out the vote and remove barriers during an election year, we should also expand opportunities, remove barriers, and also provide accessibility to volunteers more broadly. You know, essentially applying a DEI lens to mechanisms that engage volunteers. Additionally, you know, the nonprofit sector at large, and this is a pre-COVID number, but over 80% of nonprofits in pre-COVID times were led by people who self-identified as white, Caucasian, and European descent. I suspect that statistic is still current. So what I'm seeing is that not only are BIPOC communities not at the decision-making table, but they also have less access to even volunteer and have a voice within the same organizations that might actually be advocating for them. And to me, I see that as a critical issue when we're talking about racial justice. And so the last thing I'll share on this one point is, you know, that as we look at making a more racially just philanthropic environment, we have to think about how to make the act of service accessible by not just funding minority-led organizations, but also providing funds to organizations so that they can remove the cost burden from would-be volunteers that have less privilege. So all of these conversations are actually happening within a nonprofit sector. The other place of importance, I think, is also strengthening organizational capacity. I think most people can affirmatively voice their appreciation for volunteers. And even though they're not considered a caused area, volunteers are oftentimes the boots on the ground who are actually taking action to create capacity and also provide the direct service to solving a lot of these critical issues. So there's certainly an importance that is understood more widely. In a pre-COVID environment, there were 1.5 million tax-exempt organizations that were filed with the IRS. Close to 90% of those same organizations engage volunteers. Yet the mechanisms that are created to engage these volunteers are often very vulnerable because they're incredibly fragile. And sometimes this is due in part because of a lack of funding. I firmly believe that engaging volunteers, it requires true subject matter expertise, the infrastructure, the training, communication channels, and staff who are equipped and engaged to effectively engage these volunteers. And I think Curtis and some of the other panelists have also echoed this. Yet there's a lack of funding to ensure this is being done correctly. And the issue I see here is that these mechanisms can be fragile and quickly become ineffective or break down completely. And I've been to Greg Baldwin's point, I think we have seen some of that through 2020 and since the COVID-19 pandemic. And this is where I think strategic philanthropy really has an opportunity and has a great importance. Funders can solve some of this by not just verbally recognizing the importance of volunteers, but actually funding the mechanisms that are designed to engage them effectively. And I say that as a career engagement professional who's dedicated my life to engaging volunteers professionally, and having seen this through the nonprofit sector, now as a commissioner for the state of Maryland, and also within the lens of corporate employee volunteerism. One of the biggest barriers that I've seen in all of my work when engaging volunteers are associated with the costs to both the volunteer and the organization that's engaging them. So the last thing I'll share on this is really how this really underscores the importance of cross-sector support. And on that point, this is why I see that there's a great importance for cross-sector coalition building between strategic philanthropy and organizations engaged in building more positive cultures of service. Matter of fact, one such organization I support is doing just that. The organization is called the National Alliance for Strategic Volunteer Engagement. And this organization was actually born several years ago to address this very issue. They're a cross-sector coalition of leaders, funders, volunteer engagement professionals like myself, researchers and consultants. And the mission really is to spur collective action towards embracing volunteer engagement as that key strategy for driving positive community change. Pretty much everything that I shared, and I think most of the panelists have talked about. And there are really two goals in mind. Of course, one is to support leaders in actually prioritizing volunteer engagement as that key strategy for capacity building. But also the second goal being to gain support from strategic philanthropy organizations, right? Corporate, community, and family foundations to support their grantees in strategically deploying human capital, which is that renewable resource. And of course, one foundation that we actually highlight as the National Alliance is who's doing that very well is the Leedy Foundation, specifically the Funders Guide that Jane Justice spoke of. In addition to pointing to some of the handful of really great case studies that are shared on their website and the work that they're doing to fund volunteer engagement. And of course, this isn't just a matter of opinion. There's certainly research that actually demonstrates the strong and clear connection between organizations that operate with volunteer engagement as that core strategy and their overall positive health and effectiveness of that organization. Unfortunately, most lack the necessary support and direction to strategically deploy volunteers. And that is in part because there is a great need for that funding. And so my final word in conclusion is that for all these reasons, I see that there's a critical role for funders to play in supporting organizations in their work to solve the critical issues. And it really starts by strengthening their capacity to engage volunteers through greater funding.
Thank you, Jerome. This segues beautifully into the last segment, and I'm sure by now you have many questions and lots you would like to continue discussing with each of our panelists. Working with the Organization for Institutional Excellence here at the University of Texas, Noel Landon and I have been updating, refreshing, and revising a tool that we had developed and has been used in collaboration with Points of Light. We're currently calling it the Index for Volunteer Engagement, but the real focus is how do we strengthen organizations based on what we know in research as being the critical components of successful, effective groups that employ or engage volunteers to maximize the mission of the organization and expand its impact. Noel is going to be providing some information on the tool that will be ready for beta testing in the very near future and share some of the work we're doing in this issue. Noel?
Great. Thank you, Sarah Jane, for passing that over to me. And yes, there's so much to build on. I was sitting there, almost started making notes. I need to mention this, I need to mention that from what other people had discussed. And so I appreciate being here. If we can start my slides, that would be great with the first one. Thank you, Rachel. Just to kind of begin, my name is Noel Landed, and just kind of frame why I'm here and why this is incredibly interesting to me as a researcher over, we're actually housed in the School of Social Work. And this is an institute that's been around for a long time, and it primarily got its start measuring employee engagement, burnout, job satisfaction, morale, and it's been incorporated as part of the strategic planning system for the state. And as such, we measure now a lot of employee engagement data for most state agencies. We do about 250,000 employees every year. We conduct employee engagement surveys. And when I got very excited when this conversation started now, I guess it was a couple years ago, about trying to rework and look at this instrumentation that was used to measure volunteer engagement, I got very excited because, you know, as Sarah Jane mentioned earlier on, volunteers don't usually show up on an org chart. And I have a lot of volunteer experience, but we haven't really considered it to measure it as part of an organizational capacity or as a big function of an organization. And I think that's really a shortcoming of ours, because we have been measuring employee engagement, but many of our organizations, we work with lots of nonprofit, a lot of child welfare organizations, a lot of organizations that receive monies from foundations. We were just excited to be able to measure volunteers as part of that. So we do measure employee engagement. We get a good sense of whether or not employees are ready to work, what the work environment is. We thought about how we would work volunteers into that. We do customer and client satisfaction type surveys, which of course volunteers have a big impact on the experience that an individual may have within a nonprofit organization. We know that leadership is essential to how well the organization functions, as to whether or not it is an engaging environment, whether or not volunteers are fully utilized. So we measure leadership engagement as well. And then we do all kinds of other custom things to kind of measure this. And when we started thinking about incorporating this index of volunteer engagement, I'm like, wow, this is such a good fit, because volunteers interact with employees, interact with clients, interact with leadership. And so it needs to be part of that big picture. So I was very excited about that, because we really specialize on taking this soft measure of how we think and feel about things and converting it to a hard number, so that you can benchmark, so you can make decisions, so that you're able to kind of see and measure a metric as to where you're going. So as we move on to the next slide, I kind of like to talk about the index of volunteer engagement and what that instrument looks like. So first of all, it's important to understand that we need to have metrics and measures so that we're able to better have strategic engagement. I liken it to, if you have a basketball hoop up there and you start chucking a ball all over the court, and you don't have something that you're shooting for or that you're measuring, it's kind of a silly game, right? If we were just throwing a ball randomly around a room, it doesn't really tell us where we're going. But if we have a hoop up there and we have a metric and we have a direction and we have instructions and we have the ability to get to that hoop, we're able to better have strategic engagement and actually have a purpose behind our goal. And when we began looking at this instrumentation and looking at the kind of the past way things were measured, we really said we need to do a better job at measuring a return on investment, because I've been a president of boards before, and the investment that we put in on volunteers and the return on that is just incredible. It multiplies so much more our capacity to do things. And we need that good metric in order to build good capacity. We need to have, we need to know where we're falling short and are able to build that capacity. And it helps to have some good benchmarking. So we're designing, we're redesigning the past instrumentation, putting in some new features in order to do those things, strategically engage, return on investment calculations, build better capacity and benchmarking. We broke it into three, if you will, domains of establishing the foundation, what needs to happen first. When we work with volunteerism, when we're going to measure the leadership involvement, the ability of the organization to plan and to work with volunteers, it's always critically important to look at funding and resource allocation. One of my professors, I remember in his graduate school, said, you always need to look at the budget, because what the budget says dictates where the organization goes. So where are we funding and how are we allocating resources? And now this growing need that we always had in the back of our mind, okay, we're going to look at technology. Well, now we're really going to look at technology, right? Because we have moved to such an importance of interacting with technology. We also have a domain that looks at volunteer engagement. How do we cultivate those volunteers? How do we recruit and bring them in and onboarding them? What kind of experiences do we give them to really integrate them, to engage them within the organization? How do we supervise and support them while they're there? And how do we continuously train them and develop them? Because a volunteer, like an employee, likes to have, if you will, kind of a career path, the ability to be volunteered, give some experience, have a little more experience. And pretty soon, if you train the volunteer and you engage them in the right way, pretty soon your volunteers are relieving other volunteers. And then what is the impact and outcome? How do we, track this? How do we evaluate it? How well are we communicating back and forth? Again, communication has all kinds of new challenges with the technology as it's come. Is this growing? Is this changing? And do we have a good sense of partnership and collaboration amongst our various types of organization? So we're reconfiguring the instrument to still take, the good things from the past and not lose those, but putting it in a different light, modernizing the instrumentation as we move forward. If we go to the next slide, what you'll see as well is that we're modifying the process, and this is just a sample splash page. Each organization that participates in this, as well as kind of a hierarchy, and I'll explain that in a minute. Organizations are able to go into a system that we're designing, and a lot of it's going to be self-service. It's going to be very scalable, so that if we do one part of an organization, let's just say a YMCA, we'd be able to group lots of YMCAs together so that they're able to feed into the system. Because we're going to be housing the data and controlling that data along that time, we're going to be able to get better reporting mechanisms for over time data. The online portal is going to allow us to have a centralized source for putting resources on demand, and also data access. So we're making the system in such a way that organizations that participate in the index of volunteer engagement are able to go online, set up their assessment, take their assessment, get their reports, get comparative benchmarks, compare themselves. Any type of trainer or foundation that wants to view their various organizations, there will be the ability to set that up as well if that's agreeable to the organization. So just a lot more functionality in that. And then the next slide, there's going to be a very enhanced reporting capability. We're going to pull in a few really unique elements. One is it's going to be the new reports for this capacity building instrument is going to be much more icon and graphically driven. We know that, picture speaks 1,000 words. I do a lot of legislative testimony, and I do a lot of try to take very complex things and put them into one picture, and a picture says 1,000 words. I mean, if you put the right kind of image and the right kind of data in front of people, they're able to use that much more effectively. The reporting is also going to allow us to group things, which will allow us to provide better benchmarking amongst different types of organizations. It's going to be a lot more customizable so that foundations or larger organizations, if they have a group underneath them and they want to measure the capacity, volunteer capacity of all their different organizations, we would be able to do that, create some benchmarking, and really try to pull out of the data some very specific things to allow them to see what their current capacity is, what their current return on investment is, what their current level of satisfaction is amongst employees and volunteers. So we're redoing that process, trying to provide a lot more resources, really provide a lot richer data source to really understand the issue of volunteer engagement a lot more effectively. And we're excited to do it. And then hopefully be rolling it out here within next couple months. So that's kind of an update on where we are with that process.
Thank you, Noel. We're excited too, because we see this not only as a tool where we've been working with Points of Light to support training, but we believe that foundations should be asking organizations that they fund to be assessed on their stewardship of their community resources. As Jane pointed out, it is a renewable resource. It should be geared to maximize the mission and expand the impact of an organization, but it should be just as important as the dollars that are contributed to an organization, so that you know as a funder that this organization is doing its best to achieve its outcomes through all the resources available to it. At this point, we finally have an opportunity for those of you who are in the audience to ask questions, and I'm going to need to sort of rearrange my view here so I can see all of you. I'm asking that you raise a hand if you'd like to, a Zoom hand, if you have a question that you would like to address to the group, and you might identify who you would like to address it to. And we will cover as many of those as possible. If we don't get to everybody, then we would ask that you put your questions in Zoom, or I'm sorry, in chat. We are on Zoom. And I will turn to RGK Center staff to help me keep track of where hands might be appearing. But before we do that, one last thing, and that is that on this Zoom, there are some people who have been involved with helping us with these various programs and with the index. And I would like to give a shout out to Beth and to Meg, who was involved early on. And I'm sorry that I don't have a good view of everybody, but we really appreciate all of the work that you have helped us with in this regard. So, questions? The silence is deafening. Craig.
Yeah, on the index, how do you anticipate getting organizations to engage and get involved and share their data? That's often been a challenge.
Noel, do you want to take a first crack at that? You're on mute.
Yes, I can. Had to find myself on the screen.
Yes.
Well, my understanding is that there are many organizations that already work with consulting organizations, hubs, if you will, and this would be kind of an ongoing diagnosis, right? And so we would also like to try to work with, encourage foundations, as Sarah Jane had mentioned, to be able to, work with their funded organizations to encourage them to take capacity building organizations. And what we're going to do is we already measure, we work with about 35 different states, nonprofit organizations across the state. We're gonna roll it out to them as well to really make it well known that we have this instrumentation, we have this ability, if you will, to measure capacity for volunteer engagement and encourage them to take it. And then we're going to start to triangulate it with employee engagement and leadership data and 360 data to try to really give them a full picture of how their organization functions. So I think, we're going to keep promoting and rolling it out and providing a very valuable set of data that they can't get anywhere else, so.
And to further answer that, Craig, we've been working closely with Points of Light, and they've been using the instrument as a component of their service enterprise initiative. So organizations take the assessment and then they are followed up with a trainer and a coach and get additional information and support in improving programs through the training, and use this assessment as sort of a baseline. in the past, it's not been possible to track the data from one taking of the assessment to the next, and we will now be able to do that. And as Noel indicated, also to group it with like organizations, as well as triangulate it with other possible assessment tools.
Thanks, that's helpful. And we are a service enterprise training hub ourselves.
Okay, yeah, well, this would be the service enterprise revision. And we will also be pilot testing it or beta testing it, as the terminology is now, and we'll be back in touch with you when we're ready for that, but that's not very far off at all. Jane.
I'm so proud of myself that I found the raise the hand thing and have my mute button off. I want to take a minute to expand on what I said about our guides. You can not only go to our website and download those, but I would suggest one of the first things that we need to be doing is just elevating this conversation. It doesn't happen very often between funders and nonprofit organizations. So anything funders can do to initiate it. And our guide for funders has a lot of great sections in there that just become discussion starters. And the one for nonprofits, if you had copies of those to hand out to some of your key grantees, saying, here's a tool that might be helpful to you as you seek support in volunteer engagement. So we also are available to send you printed copies of those guides, as well as the downloads of it.
Well, I would like to add that we have a tool as well, and it's a strategic engagement, strategic volunteer engagement, a guide for nonprofits, and the downloadable PDF. Okay, anyhow, it looks like this in print. Is available, and it was a guide that was developed through one of our grants, where we worked with focus groups with executive directors and asked them candidly their opinion of volunteer engagement. And of course, it ranged everything from they're the secret sauce to our organizational success to may I never have to deal with another volunteer in my life. But the goal was, what are the key things that an organization needs to know, that an executive director needs to know? And they wanted something brief, they wanted something targeted, and they wanted some ways to think about volunteer engagement. So this publication is also available for free download, and I believe it's been placed in chat. Other questions or comments? And do the things that our panelists have shared ring true to your experience in the field? I know we have some people in the field, and I'd be very interested in your thoughts as well. Let me ask Greg, you have done a lot of work with looking at the pandemic and COVID. What are some of the things that you see? You mentioned that the virtual component has definitely not only initiated, but has grown. What are some of the other ways you see the field changing, or the things from the pandemic moving into the future based on this experience?
Yeah, I think one of the biggest changes that, certainly having been in the field for a long time over the last year, that's significantly changed is that volunteering has always kind of operated under the radar, I think, as a policy issue in the national conversations, or at least it's evolved and it, over the last 20 years. And I think this past year, volunteer engagement really resurfaced as a national policy issue. There's far more people asking questions about how would we really scale and encourage more volunteering across the country, largely because so many communities experienced what it was like to not have volunteers. In California, they had to roll out the National Guard to run the food banks for a while. And I think that absence of volunteers for the first time reminded people and showed people what they hadn't seen before, which was just how important that invisible force is to the health of their community. So I think that will continue. That's happening in DC. It's happening in local state houses. I know Chris is on the line. Chris Bugby. I know he's championing amazing things in Texas, and the One Star Foundation. I know he's been a part of a lot of conversations that I've been a part of as well. And I think the other amazing thing that's changed that I'm excited about, I don't know how long it will last, but everybody has set aside, at least temporarily, their own self-interest to collaborate and work together in ways that I couldn't have imagined happening, even 2 years ago, to figure out new possibilities for volunteering and work across, sectors and boundaries and race and, institutional political boundaries. And that's been, it's been actually rewarding to be a part of that. And I hope that will continue.
Chris, do you have any thoughts you'd like to add?
Yeah, I was just thinking, One Star, we're talking a lot about trying to make volunteerism more accessible, with kind of a DEI lens. And I just wondered if anyone on the panel is aware of research or some best practices on ways that, we're recommending doing that. Just thinking about volunteerism across race and ethnic, what should we be calling it? What kind of best practices should we be thinking about to just make this idea where everybody can do something, but it really feels like that's true and really accessible.
Jerome, do you want to offer some thoughts? And I'd also like to turn to Mike on this question too.
Yeah, thanks. Thanks for that question, Chris. Yeah, so gosh, I think there are a lot of different things to cover here. So I'll think of how to keep this very brief. But when I think about engaging human capital, I think very similar to how a company would think about applying DEI and anti-racism practices through human resources and talent acquisition, right? That's been, I think, a common practice. And I think the first place that I think there are a lot of practices to glean from, and then taking those same concepts and applying them through the mechanisms that actually engage volunteers. What I'll always say is, as somebody who engages volunteers on a daily basis, I actually have a lot more interaction with people than most HR managers and HR directors do, right? A lot of HR folks, they're focused on internal people, but through my work engaging people externally, I generally have a lot more contact. But there are things that you can do in terms of the language, right? Like using like a race equity guide in terms of how you're communicating to specific communities of volunteers, and really understanding the social and cultural implications, or even religious implications, right? When we think about volunteer engagement, it's generally through a very westernized lens. And I think one of the things that Sarah Jane mentioned up front is that it's not universally understood globally. Through my work with Mary International, I have an opportunity to see how that plays out over 134 countries and territories. And not everybody universally understands it or values it. The way that we understand it is oftentimes through through the 1700s, through the Great Awakening, and how we understand it as a nation that was formed off of, Christian values. So that's one thing to certainly consider and think about, right? Race equity language. There's actually a guide that the Sierra Club has actually posted in 2018. Sierra Club, they had a whole self-reckoning this past year about their own issues with a racist past and perpetuating issues that they were working to solve. And they have a race equity guide that they have published and that they actually use internally for their own staff, but also in how their chapters engage volunteers. And that's like one thought. I have too many thoughts, and I would certainly, I would love to connect with you one-on-one, Chris, and I would be more than happy to be a thought partner in what you might have in mind. Because again, I think the race equity language is like one part of it, but then there are other things that I think funding can help to help bridge that economic divide that historically marginalized populations feel as a barrier to being involved in volunteerism.
Mike, do you have anything you'd like to add?
Yeah, I'll just add that this is a time when you need to realize that you don't need to do this alone. We combined with leadership of Greater Washington to sponsor their anti-racism study course community-wide for the last 4 or 5 months, and then opened it up to all of our CEOs of our affiliates around the country because it was done virtually anyway. And it was marvelous. It was a great experience for all of us, and continues to be. I would say be looking for partners. I would not do this alone. I think you gain so much by combining with others who have the same purpose, but yet maybe have more street cred and have been in the trenches with it longer. And so that's what we have been looking for.
Thank you. And I know Meg had wanted to ask a question, and so does Curtis. So Meg?
Thanks. I was just curious about tying into the previous comment, whether there was a DEI component to the tool that you and Dr. Landut were discussing?
The main DEI component at this point is getting information about the composition of the demographic composition. And we also have an initial work on a 360 evaluation from volunteers, and is what organizations saying comparable to what the individuals who are actually serving with that organization saying about it. So that would indirectly get at some of this, but it's a really good point. A very good point. Curtis.
I was very taken with the comment about helping to pay for volunteers' transportation as a way in which to think about a barrier to recruitment of volunteers. And it made me think also in terms of racial participation as well. I know that when we had a center that was open to nonprofit organizations to use as a conference center, we found we had to take an active role to reach out to the minority organizations to make them feel welcome, as opposed to simply saying this is open to any nonprofit that wants to use it. We had to be actively engaged in helping communicate that all people were welcome to use it. All nonprofit organizations were welcome to use it. So I'm curious as to this idea of reaching out to minority communities. Is that being widely adopted by nonprofit organizations today? And if so, are they using social media because of COVID? What techniques does anybody know that anybody's using to reach out to these communities and make some sort of contact with them?
If somebody has a response, I'll just let you speak up.
I mean, I'll join in. We see, Curtis, we see a lot of, some of the larger conversations about what terms people use and cultural assumptions that we make about volunteering all comes into play. And what we've seen a lot of over the last 18 months for sure is the mutual aid movement, which is, a form of volunteering. It's got different labels, but it's really the neighbor helping neighbor at its purest level. Local communities that get themselves organized to, deliver food to, people at home, do shopping for other people. It's, it's not the structured, kind of Red Cross style volunteering. It's very organic and grassroots. And we've seen that those mutual aid society communities have really thrived and flourished in communities of color and in inner cities, and it's something that we've kind of watched and encouraged and been proud to see that. Maybe not proud, just fascinated to watch that bring communities together in ways that are very different than the traditional kind of get a volunteer manager and organize a volunteer program. So I think that's a kind of an emerging trend that we'll see a lot more of over the next couple of years.
And if I'm not mistaken, the Retired Senior Volunteer Program has been able to provide some transportation assistance, but that's to a very defined and specific population based on age. The other thing I'd like to mention, just from earlier on, there was the reference to policy issues, and most people are not aware that the Fair Labor Standards Act, developed in the 40s, was developed in part in order to accommodate the different wage structure of the Civilian Conservation Corps. So it has been a policy issue, but there are other policies that need to be addressed relative to volunteerism also. We are kind of coming to the end of our Q&A unless I'm missing somebody's specific question. And I'm going to depend on staff. I don't think that I am at this point. I'd like to come back to our panelists and ask you, perhaps in the order in which you spoke originally, to share sort of a final thought, an idea and concern that you have as we look forward into the future of volunteerism and increasing its visibility. So I think that starts us with you, Greg, if I have my memory correct.
Well, one thing I'll share with all of you and hope that you'll learn more about it and lend your support if and when this unfolds. But the independent sector has recently drafted an executive order that would create a new White House office on civil society in the nonprofit sector. Volunteering as a standalone issue is one of the kind of platform planks, policy issues that this new office, if it was created, would be responsible for, evaluating current policies and what what government might be able to do, the public sector, to elevate and advance volunteering across the country. I think typically, we're not good at getting organized, and I hope like the Dr. Seuss book that hasn't been canceled, all of the what is it, Horton Hears a Who, that forums like this, that our voice will be heard, and the perspective of how important volunteering is something that is an opportunity to educate the public sector in ways that they desperately need. So I hope when the invite comes to show up at the White House office on a Zoom call, that Curtis and Sarah Jane and Mara and David, all of you will show up and be ready to speak up and speak loudly and make sure that the next generation of young people can benefit from all the amazing work that volunteers do in their local communities.
Thank you, Greg. Jane, your thoughts.
Well, I have to say, first of all, that this is an incredibly hopeful conversation that we've had. There's no shortage of unhopeful things going on. So based on that, I think I would come back to this idea, especially for funders, that volunteerism or volunteer engagement is a program. I think we as funders have got to look past that and see it as the cost-effective strategy that assists all organizations, all community groups in enhancing and engaging in the accomplishment of their missions. And as Greg mentioned, I hadn't really thought about it, but this really is a kind of yeasty, collaborative, maybe very short window that we have of people saying, what are you doing and what can we do together and how can we do it differently? And I imagine that it's a good time for these partnerships to start happening and for us to make sure that as we rebuild after COVID, the nonprofit sector as a whole, that we don't keep building the same houses on the same cliffs. And so how do we take this opportunity to really think about how we rebuild the sector to be a stronger sector?
Very thoughtful. Thank you. And that takes us to you, Mike.
Yeah, I think as we think about nonprofit leadership and what nonprofit organizations are facing now, I think this year, in particular, the next 12 months this year is even more critical than last year was. Last year, we really didn't have a choice. We were sort of forced to be nimble, and actually some of that was healthy for us. I know it was healthy for my organization. We can sometimes really go in the weeds, like really go in the weeds. And this really kind of forced us to deal with the essence of issues. I think now moving forward into this year, I think we have a polarity. that all leaders are going to face. And that polarity is going to be the need for stabilization. Everyone feels the need to have some security, to know their job is secure, their programs are secure, their services are secure. Contrasting that on the polarity with the need for innovation and the fact that there's an opportunity for innovation. He who moves fast and is nimble is going to be the one that seizes it first. And I think that's the dilemma that and the polarity that all nonprofit leaders are going to face in this coming year is that balancing act between providing stability and at the same time capitalizing on the opportunity for innovation to really kind of seize that moment.
Thank you. Jerome, your thoughts?
Yeah, so I don't know that I have a concern. I think we all shared some concerns from what we've seen over this past year and even before that. So I'm going to just share a thought of optimism. Through the work that I do with the state of Maryland as a commissioner, we have now seen like the largest investment in service and volunteerism in service and volunteerism than I think that we've ever seen before. And that's of course it's federal funding that has been sort of funneled down to the different state service commissions, but it certainly gives me hope that the private foundation community is not far behind in how they're understanding the importance of service and volunteerism. I think since COVID-19 and to Jane's point, I've seen people become much more open-minded to like new ideas of change and systems and structures. And so to me, there's no better time than the present as we work to solve so many critical issues that volunteers are oftentimes at the forefront and often engaged to solve. So not so much of a concern, but a thought of optimism and hope.
Thank you. Noel, are there thoughts you'd like to share?
Well, I think that when I look at everyone's comments again, I think what Jerome and Greg said, this national importance is a tremendous investment. How do we continue to provide metrics or the ability to kind of prove up that it is a good return on investment? That's what I feel is critically my point in this process as well. And what Jane said about it being an essential program within an organization, again, as I kind of presented in my slides, there's an employee piece, a leadership piece, a customer piece. How does that all integrate together, and how can one, because we know that one will impact the other. So how can we build an organization's engagement, build its capacity to better build its volunteer capacity as well, I think is critically important. And what Mike said, this idea of being nimble. Well, last year was all about being nimble, right? And that's going to stay to some extent. So we need metrics and measurements and data to help us be more nimble and see how we move forward.
Before I turn to Curtis for his closing thoughts, I would like to say relative to Meg's comment, one of the problems is that a lot of programs aren't keeping good data. And that's always been one of the concerns about the instrument as the service enterprise diagnostic was our coaches and our trainers would say, we don't have a good picture of the organization. Well, they didn't have a good picture because the organization doesn't have a good picture. So it's important that there is a focus on useful data as opposed to just data for the sake of data. And hopefully with the index, we'll be able to start gathering some of that in a more consistent fashion. Curtis, you opened our conversation. You have the opportunity to provide some closing thoughts before we turn to David.
Yeah, I would like to end on a note of inspiration, if you will. I've always believed that the volunteer experience was one of the great ways we could cross boundaries and help us to understand one another and bond with each other. We've been through a terrible period of polarization, and it continues in our society. And I happen to be looking back over some speeches that I had made about volunteerism over the years in preparation for this. And I came across a quote, I'll end with this, from John Gardner, who was in the LBJ's cabinet and was a giant thinker, former head of the Carnegie Foundation. And he wrote this in 1995, 25 years ago. A community lives in the minds of its members, in shared assumptions, beliefs, customs, ideas that give meaning, ideas that motivate. The civility that gives dignity to our common life is not instinctive, and it is not accidental. Decency is learned. Civility is a habit. Let's say it to everyone who will listen. Lend a hand. Out of concern for your community, out of love for our country, out of the depths of whatever faith you hold, lend a hand.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Curtis. That's a wonderful way to bring together what has been going on here in the last hour and a half. And before I turn it to David, I want to thank all of you for being here. It's been wonderful to see old friends and new faces, and we're so glad you could be here. David.
Thank you, Sarah Jane. Well, Curtis, I do feel inspired and hopeful after this panel. I want to just begin by thanking all of our panelists for sharing your time, your expertise, your experiences around this critical topic of volunteer engagement for the sector. So Sarah Jane, great panel. Curtis, thank you for being with us as always. And Greg, Jane, Mike, Jerome, Noel, really good to see you. And thank you for everything that you contributed to today's discussion. And thanks again to each one of you for taking time out of your busy schedules and helping us celebrate the RGK Center's 20th anniversary. Curtis, it's probably hard to believe that it's been 20 years. And to our A-team that made all of this happen. So we have alumni, Erica Eckwurzel, Maura Porter, our associate director, Sydney Wilburn, and our amazing graduate student and one of our current Kosmetsky fellows, Kara Cook. That this would not have happened without all of their work, meeting every week and making this a reality. So great job, y'all. We pulled it off. And one closing thought, maybe springboarding off of both Greg and Curtis's remarks. My hope is for all of you that you continue to offer and receive mutual aid and lending a hand where it's needed as we navigate the next several months of the pandemic and do what we try to do to cultivate a more civil society. And so with that, stay in touch, stay safe. I hope everyone continues to do well. And it was really just wonderful to see everybody. Thank you so much.